The dust-laden wind swept through Red Bluff, Arizona Territory, in the summer of 1883, carrying with it the desperate sobs of Margaret Kendrick as she was dragged onto the auction platform in the town square. Her honey-brown hair fell in disarray around her tear-streaked face, her wrists bound with coarse rope that bit into her skin. The crowd of men ranchers, miners, and drifters gathered around the wooden platform with hungry eyes, their voices a low murmur of anticipation as Sheriff Holden cleared his throat to speak. $500, the sheriff announced, his voice booming across the square. That's the debt owed to Mr. James Blackwell by the late Thomas Kendrick. As his only living kin, Miss Kendrick here is responsible. Bidding starts at $500. Margaret's voice broke as she tried to speak over the rising calls of the crowd. Please, I've told you a dozen times. My father owed nothing to that man. The debt was paid before he died. Sheriff Holden silenced her with a sharp look. The court has made its ruling, Miss Kendrick. Mr. Blackwell has legal papers and you have none. Now, do we have $500? The crowd grew louder, but Margaret could barely hear them over the pounding of her heart. 3 weeks ago, she had been teaching at the schoolhouse, living in the small home her father had built with his own hands. Now, after his sudden death from fever, she was being sold into servitude for a debt she knew her father had paid in full. $500, called a gruff voice from the back. $525, shouted another. Margaret scanned the crowd desperately, searching for a sympathetic face among the sea of strangers. Red Bluff had been her home for only 8 months, not long enough to form the kind of friendships that might save her now. $600, called a paunchy man with a gold tooth that glinted in the sunlight. $650? This from a rancher whose reputation for cruelty toward his workers was well known throughout the territory. As the bids climbed higher, Margaret's hope diminished. She had no one to turn to, no money of her own. The schoolhouse had already replaced her with a young man from back east. $700, came a new voice, deep and steady. The crowd parted and a tall figure stepped forward. Dust clung to his long black coat, and the wide brim of his hat shadowed his face. As he approached the platform, Margaret caught her first clear glimpse of him. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with a sun-weathered face and eyes the color of a clear winter sky. A thin scar ran along his jawline, and his stance spoke of a man accustomed to having his words heeded. $700 from Mr. Wade Harrington, the sheriff announced, a note of respect in his voice that had been absent before. Do I hear $750? $800, the gold-toothed man countered quickly. Wade Harrington stepped closer to the platform, his spurs jingling softly against the hard-packed dirt. Sheriff, he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly hushed crowd, this auction is a disgrace to this town. Sheriff Holden's face reddened. Now see here, Harrington, I know Thomas Kendrick, Wade continued, removing his hat and holding it against his chest. Honest man, paid his debts. This woman is being sold for a debt that doesn't exist. Blackwell, a thin man with oiled hair and an expensive suit, pushed his way to the front. The court has ruled, Harrington. The debt is legal. Wade's eyes never left Margaret's face as he spoke. $1,000. A murmur ran through the crowd. $1,500, Blackwell snapped, his face contorted with anger. Wade placed his hat back on his head, then reached inside his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. I pay what matters, he said, tossing the pouch to the sheriff. $500 for the alleged debt. Another $500 for the lady's freedom papers, properly notarized. And this, he pulled a folded document from his pocket, is a receipt showing Thomas Kendrick paid Blackwell in full 3 months ago, witnessed by Judge Wilson in Tucson. The sheriff fumbled with the pouch, then unfolded the document with shaking hands. The crowd pressed closer, their expressions shifting from entertainment to confusion to outrage. This appears to be in order, Sheriff Holden admitted reluctantly, his eyes darting to Blackwell, who had gone pale. That's a forgery, Blackwell sputtered. Judge Wilson's seal is right there, Wade replied calmly. I rode to Tucson myself when I heard what was happening here. The judge remembers the transaction clearly." Margaret stood frozen, unable to comprehend the sudden shift in her fate. Wade climbed the steps to the platform and approached her, his movements slow and deliberate, as if she were a frightened animal he didn't want to startle. "Miss Kendrick," he said softly, "I was a friend of your father's. We worked together in the silver mines near Tombstone before he moved here with you." He produced a knife and carefully cut the ropes binding her wrists. "I'm sorry I didn't get here sooner." "I don't understand," Margaret whispered, rubbing her raw wrists. "How did you know?" "Your father wrote to me when he suspected Blackwell might try something like this. He asked me to look out for you if anything happened to him." Wade turned to address the sheriff. "I believe we're finished here." Sheriff Holden nodded, avoiding Wade's gaze. "The auction is canceled." "Miss Kendrick is free to go." Blackwell lunged forward, his face twisted with rage. "This isn't over, Harrington." Wade's hand moved to rest on the pistol at his hip. "For your sake, Blackwell, it had better be." The crowd dispersed quickly, many of them casting shamefaced glances at Margaret as they left. Wade offered her his arm. "May I escort you home, Miss Kendrick?" Margaret hesitated only a moment before taking his arm. Her legs felt unsteady as they descended the platform steps. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Harrington." "Wade," he corrected gently. "And there's no need for thanks. Your father was a good man. He'd have done the same for me." As they walked away from the town square, Margaret felt the weight of stares from windows and doorways, but for the first time that day, she stood tall. The nightmare wasn't over. Blackwell's expression had promised retribution, but she was no longer facing it alone. "How long will you be in Red Bluff?" she asked as they approached the small clapboard house at the edge of town. Wade's eyes scanned the horizon, his expression unreadable. "As long as it takes to make sure you're safe, Miss Kendrick." "Margaret," she said, meeting his gaze steadily. "If we're to be friends, you must call me Margaret." A small smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Margaret," he agreed, tipping his hat slightly. "I think your father would approve of us being friends." As they reached her door, a sense of security she hadn't felt since her father's death settled over Margaret. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to hope it might bring something good. Wade Harrington hadn't planned on staying in Red Bluff for more than a few days, just long enough to ensure Margaret Kendrick's safety. Yet a week had passed, and still he remained, taking a room at the boarding house across town and spending his days making inquiries about James Blackwell. The morning was crisp as Wade made his way to Margaret's house, carrying a basket of supplies from the general store. He'd noticed her pantry was nearly bare the previous evening when she'd insisted on cooking him supper to show her gratitude. He rapped lightly on the door, and it opened almost immediately, as if she'd been waiting. The sight of her still caught him off guard. Today, her hair was neatly pinned up, and she wore a simple blue dress that brought out the flecks of gold in her hazel eyes. "Good morning," she said, her smile warming as she noticed the basket. "What's this?" "Just a few things from Jameson's store. Flour, coffee, some bacon." He handed her the basket. "I noticed you were running low." Margaret's cheeks flushed slightly. "That's very kind, but I can't accept charity, Wade." "It's not charity when it's between friends," he replied, using her own words against her with a slight smile. "Besides, I spoke with Mr. Turner at the bank yesterday. Your father had a small account there. It's rightfully yours now." Her eyes widened. "But the sheriff said there was nothing." "The sheriff was mistaken," Wade said carefully, "or perhaps deliberately misinformed. Either way, Turner has the paperwork ready for your signature." She invited him in, setting the basket on her small kitchen table. "I don't understand any of this. How could Blackwell claim my father owed him money? Why would the sheriff and the town judge go along with it?" Wade sat down at her invitation, removing his hat and placing it on the table beside him. "Blackwell has been buying up land around Red Bluff for the past year. Your father's property sits on what might be a valuable water source for the surrounding ranches. But to auction a person for a fake debt, that's not just dishonest, it's illegal." In a town this size, with the right people in your pocket, the law can be whatever you want it to be. Wade's voice held the bitterness of experience. Margaret poured them both coffee, her hands trembling slightly. What will stop him from trying again? For now, the fact that Judge Wilson's documentation proves your father paid his debt. And Wade hesitated. And what? And the fact that I'm here, he finished. Blackwell is a coward at heart. He won't move against you directly as long as he knows you have protection. Margaret set down her cup with deliberate care. But you won't stay in Red Bluff forever. The statement hung between them, neither a question nor an accusation, but a simple acknowledgement of reality. Wade had never stayed anywhere for long, not since the war. He drifted from mining camps to cattle drives to small town sheriff's offices, never putting down roots. No, he agreed finally, but I'll stay until we're certain you're safe. She nodded, her expression carefully composed. Then we should focus on making that happen as quickly as possible. I wouldn't want to impose on your time any longer than necessary. Wade felt an unexpected twist in his chest at her formal tone. It's no imposition, Margaret. Before she could respond, a sharp knock at the door startled them both. Wade was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his gun. "Miss Kendrick," called a female voice. "It's Eliza Turner from the bank." Margaret opened the door to reveal a plump, middle-aged woman clutching a leather portfolio. "Oh, Mr. Harrington, you're here too. Good." Mrs. Turner bustled in without waiting for an invitation. "I've brought the papers my husband mentioned. There's more than just the bank account, Miss Kendrick." She spread the documents on the table, pointing to various signatures and seals. "Your father was quite thorough. He updated his will just 2 months ago, leaving everything to you, of course, but also naming Mr. Harrington here as the executor of his estate should anything happen to him." Wade's surprise must have shown on his face, because Mrs. Turner looked at him sharply. "Didn't you know?" "Mr. Kendrick spoke very highly of you, said there was no one he trusted more." "We hadn't spoken in some time," Wade admitted. "I had no idea he'd named me executor." Margaret looked equally stunned. "Why would my father not tell me about any of this?" Mrs. Turner's expression softened. "Perhaps he didn't want to worry you, dear. The rumors about Blackwell have been circulating for months. Your father may have been taking precautions." Wade examined the will more closely. Thomas Kendrick had indeed left everything to his daughter, the house, the 5 acres surrounding it, and a sum of money that, while not substantial, would allow Margaret to live comfortably for several years if managed carefully. "There's something else, Mrs. Turner said, producing another document from her portfolio. "Your father filed a formal complaint against Mr. Blackwell with the territorial court in Prescott, alleging harassment and threats. The hearing is scheduled for next month." Wade's eyes met Margaret's across the table. "Your father knew Blackwell was coming after him. And he was fighting back," Margaret whispered, her fingers tracing her father's signature on the complaint after Mrs. Turner left, promising to return with more documents the following day. Margaret and Wade sat in silence, digesting the new information. "I should have been here," Wade finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "If I'd come when Thomas first wrote, you couldn't have prevented his fever," Margaret interrupted gently. "And you did come when it mattered most." The simple forgiveness in her words made his chest tighten. "I made a promise to your father years ago that I'd look out for you if he couldn't. I intend to keep that promise, Margaret." She looked at him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "My father was a good judge of character. If he trusted you this much, then so do I." She took a deep breath. "But I need to know more about you, Wade Harrington. If we're to face Blackwell together, I should know who's standing beside me." Wade nodded slowly. It had been years since he'd shared his story with anyone, but Margaret Kendrick had earned the right to know. "Fair enough. What would you like to know?" "Everything," she said simply. "Start at the beginning." So he did. As the morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, Wade told her about growing up on a small farm in Missouri, about joining the Union Army at 18, about the horrors he'd witnessed during the war that had left him restless and unable to settle. He told her about drifting west afterward, working as a ranch hand, a deputy, a miner, whatever honest work he could find. And he told her about meeting Thomas Kendrick in Tombstone 5 years earlier, how they'd partnered in a small silver claim that had yielded just enough for Thomas to start fresh in Red Bluff with his daughter. "He talked about you constantly," Wade said, a smile softening his features. "How smart you were, how determined. He was so proud when you became the schoolteacher here." Margaret brushed away a tear. "He never told me about you." "I asked him not to," Wade admitted. "My life, it hasn't always been peaceful. I've made enemies. I didn't want my troubles finding their way to your door. And yet here you are, bringing your troubles to defend me from mine." Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "Thank you, Wade." The warmth of her touch sent a jolt through him, and for a brief moment, Wade allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to stay, to build something permanent for once in his life. Then reality reasserted itself. Blackwell wouldn't be the last threat. The past had a way of catching up eventually. "We should focus on the hearing next month," he said, gently withdrawing his hand. "If the territorial court rules against Blackwell, it could put an end to his schemes." Margaret nodded, though something in her eyes suggested she'd noticed his retreat. "What do we need to do to prepare?" "Gather evidence. Find witnesses who can testify to Blackwell's threats against your father and keep you safe until then." A determined expression settled over Margaret's features. "Then we'd better get started." The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of activity. Wade and Margaret visited neighbors, former business associates of Thomas Kendrick, and anyone else who might have information about Blackwell's dealings. Many were reluctant to speak at first, but as word spread that the territorial court was involved, tongues began to loosen. They discovered that Blackwell had arrived in Red Bluff approximately 18 months earlier, presenting himself as a businessman from St. Louis with plans to develop the area. He'd quickly ingratiated himself with local officials, hosting lavish dinners and making generous donations to town projects. He was charming at first, Widow Reynolds told them as they sat in her parlor one afternoon. Talked about bringing the railroad through town, building a proper hotel. But then the demand started. "Sell me your land," he'd say, offering far less than it was worth. When folks refused, accidents would happen. "What kind of accidents?" Margaret asked. The widow's lips thinned. "Frank Miller's barn burned down 2 days after he turned down Blackwell's offer. The Peterson place had all its fences cut and cattle scattered. Nothing that could be proven, of course. And no one reported this," Wade pressed. "To who?" "Sheriff Holden and the town judge play cards with Blackwell every Thursday night." Widow Reynolds leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Your father was different, Miss Kendrick. He stood up to Blackwell from the start, said that spring on your property belonged to the community, not to any one man." On their walk back to Margaret's house, Wade mulled over what they'd learned. "Your father made himself Blackwell's primary obstacle, which is why Blackwell was so determined to get me and the land after father died," Margaret concluded. "But why auction me off? Why not just take the land through some legal maneuver? Your father's will was filed with the territorial court, not just locally," Wade explained. "Blackwell couldn't override it easily, but if you were legally indentured to him for a debt, he'd control me and through me the land." Margaret shuddered. "It's monstrous." Wade's hand tightened on his rifle. "It's not going to happen." They had just reached Margaret's front gate when Wade noticed movement in the shadow of a large oak tree across the road. He stepped in front of Margaret, his hand dropping to his pistol. "Show yourself," he called. A man emerged slowly, hands raised to show he was unarmed. He was young, barely more than 20, with the nervous demeanor of someone delivering unwelcome news. "Name's Billy, sir. I work for Mr. Blackwell." The young man's eyes darted around as if expecting others to be watching. "He sent me with a message for Miss Kendrick." "What message?" Margaret asked, stepping out from behind Wade despite his protective arm. "He says to drop the complaint with the territorial court. Says if you do, he'll leave you be, let you keep your land." Billy swallowed hard. If you don't, he can't guarantee your safety, madam. Wade moved forward, his expression dangerous. That sounds like a threat. Billy backed up hastily. Just delivering the message, sir. Mr. Blackwell says Miss Kendrick has until tomorrow noon to decide. After the messenger had scurried away, Wade insisted on checking the house before letting Margaret enter. Once satisfied it was secure, he built up the fire while Margaret prepared a simple supper of beans and bread. He's scared, Wade observed as they ate. The territorial court isn't in his pocket. Margaret pushed her food around her plate, her appetite gone. What if he tries something before the hearing? That's why I'm staying in your father's old shed out back starting tonight, Wade declared. I'll be close if there's trouble. Absolutely not, Margaret said firmly. That shed is barely weatherproof. I have 2 bedrooms in this house. You'll take my father's room. Wade shook his head. That wouldn't be proper, Margaret. People already talk about us spending time together. A flush rose in her cheeks. Let them talk. My reputation isn't worth your pneumonia, Wade Harrington. Their eyes locked in a battle of wills that ended when Wade sighed in resignation. Your father's room, then, but only until this business with Blackwell is settled. Later that night, as Wade lay in Thomas Kendrick's bed staring at the ceiling, he couldn't help but reflect on how complicated his simple promise had become. He'd ridden into Red Bluff intending to help Thomas's daughter and then move on, as he always did. Instead, he found himself increasingly drawn into her life, her struggles, her quiet courage, and if he was honest with himself, drawn to her as well, in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be drawn to anyone in a very long time. The sound of breaking glass shattered the silence, followed immediately by Margaret's frightened cry. Wade was on his feet instantly, gun in hand, moving swiftly toward her bedroom. Margaret, he called, pushing open her door. She was sitting up in bed, clutching the blankets to her chest, her face pale in the moonlight that streamed through the now broken window. A rock lay on the floor amid shards of glass. Stay back from the window, Wade ordered, moving to examine the rock. A piece of paper had been tied around it with string. He unfolded it carefully. In crude letters, the message read, "Leave town or burn." Wade's blood ran cold. He crossed to the window and peered out cautiously, but whoever had thrown the rock was long gone. "Are you hurt?" he asked, turning back to Margaret. She shook her head, though she was trembling visibly. "Just startled." Wade quickly covered the broken window with a spare blanket, then lit the lamp beside her bed. In the warm glow, he could see her more clearly, her hair loose around her shoulders, her nightgown modest but still more intimate than anything he'd seen her in before. He averted his eyes out of respect. "Pack a bag," he said decisively. "We're leaving." Margaret repeated, confusion replacing fear. "Where would we go?" "To Prescott. The hearing is in 2 weeks. We'll be safer there, under the territorial marshal's protection." Margaret climbed out of bed, reaching for her robe. "But my house, my father's land, will still be here after the hearing," Wade finished. "Blackwell's getting desperate, Margaret. That makes him dangerous." She tied her robe securely and faced him, her chin lifted in the stubborn gesture he was coming to know well. "I won't be driven from my home by threats, Wade. My father wouldn't run, and neither will I." Wade ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Your father would want you alive, Margaret. Blackwell's not above murder, we both know that." "Then we'll be vigilant," she countered. "We'll alert the neighbors, keep watches, but I won't abandon everything my father worked for." Her expression softened slightly. "I understand your concern, Wade, truly, but running now would only prove to Blackwell that his tactics work." Wade wanted to argue further, but he recognized the determination in her eyes. It was the same look Thomas had worn when he'd stood his ground against claim jumpers in Tombstone, outnumbered but unbowed. "All right," he conceded reluctantly, "but we're taking precautions." "No more trips into town alone. We'll take turns keeping watch at night." Margaret nodded, relief evident in her posture. "Thank you for understanding." Wade moved toward the door, suddenly acutely aware of the impropriety of their situation, him in his nightshirt, her in her robe, alone in her bedroom in the middle of the night. Try to get some rest, he said awkwardly. I'll keep watch until morning. Wade, she called softly as he reached the doorway. When he turned back, she was gazing at him with an expression that made his heart stutter in his chest. I'm glad you're here. He nodded once, not trusting himself to speak, and closed the door behind him. The following days brought an uneasy tension to Red Bluff. Blackwell's men were seen watching Margaret's house from a distance, and rumors circulated that he had hired gunmen from Tucson. Wade convinced several of the neighboring farmers to help keep watch, creating a schedule that ensured Margaret was never alone. To Wade's surprise, support for Margaret grew as word spread about Blackwell's threats. Widow Reynolds organized the women of the town to take turns visiting during the day, while several young men who had been students of Margaret's volunteered to patrol the boundaries of her property at night. The town's turning against him, Wade observed one evening as they sat on Margaret's porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. Blackwell's losing his grip. People have been afraid, Margaret replied, her hands busy with mending. But they're finding their courage now. Wade watched her nimble fingers work the needle through fabric, admiring her quiet composure in the face of danger. In the 2 weeks since he'd arrived in Red Bluff, he'd come to respect not just her bravery, but her intelligence, her compassion, and her unwavering sense of justice. Your father would be proud of you, he said softly. Margaret's hands stilled and she looked up at him with eyes that shimmered with unshed tears. Thank you. That means more than you know. The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither was ready to name. Finally, Margaret broke the silence. Tell me about your plans, Wade. After all this is over, the question caught him off guard. He'd been so focused on the immediate threat that he hadn't thought beyond the hearing. I'm not sure, move on, I suppose, find work somewhere. That's it, just drift to the next town. There was a note in her voice he couldn't quite identify. Disappointment, perhaps. Wade shifted uncomfortably. It's what I've always done. And it's made you happy, her direct gaze challenged him. Happy enough, he replied, though the words felt hollow even to his own ears. Margaret set aside her mending and leaned forward slightly. My father used to say that a rolling stone gathers no moss. I always thought he meant it as a warning, but maybe for some people, it's a choice. Are you calling me a rolling stone, Miss Kendrick? Wade asked, a smile tugging at his lips despite the serious undercurrent of their conversation. I'm wondering if you ever considered stopping, she answered simply. Finding a place that feels like home. The question stirred something in Wade that he'd long ago buried: the yearning for permanence, for connection, for a place and people to call his own. He'd convinced himself those things weren't meant for men like him, men with blood on their hands and shadows dogging their steps. I haven't had a home since I was 18, he admitted quietly. Not sure I'd recognize one if I found it. Margaret's gaze never wavered. Perhaps you haven't been looking in the right places. Before Wade could respond to the unmistakable invitation in her words, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 3 riders appeared on the road, approaching at a gallop. Wade was on his feet instantly, his rifle ready. Get inside, Margaret. She hesitated only briefly before complying, closing the front door behind her but remaining visible through the window, a small pistol in her hand that Wade had insisted she learn to use. As the riders drew closer, Wade recognized Billy, Blackwell's messenger, accompanied by 2 rough-looking men he hadn't seen before. That's far enough, Wade called when they were within earshot. The 3 pulled their horses to a stop about 20 yards from the house. Billy looked even more nervous than before, while his companions surveyed the property with the calculated assessment of hired guns. Mr. Blackwell wants to parley, Billy announced, his voice cracking slightly. Neutral ground, the Paradise Saloon tomorrow at noon. Wade kept his rifle steady. Why should Miss Kendrick trust anything Blackwell has to say? One of the other men, a tall, scarred individual with cold eyes, spoke up. Because he's offering to buy her land at a fair price. No more trouble. She can leave town with money in her pocket. And if she refuses, Wade challenged. The scarred man's thin smile didn't reach his eyes. Then things get complicated for everyone, especially you, Harrington. Wade's finger tightened on the trigger. Is that a threat? It's a fact, the man replied calmly. Blackwell knows about Dodge City, about the marshal's wife. Wade felt as if he'd been doused in ice water. No one in this territory should have known about that dark chapter of his past. Noon tomorrow, Billy repeated nervously, clearly eager to leave. Just talking, Mr. Harrington, that's all. After the riders departed, Wade remained on the porch, his mind racing. Margaret emerged from the house, her expression concerned. What did he mean about Dodge City? She asked quietly, coming to stand beside him. Wade stared at the horizon, where the last light was fading rapidly. Something that happened 3 years ago, something I'm not proud of. Margaret waited patiently, giving him the space to decide how much to reveal. I was a deputy in Dodge, he finally said, his voice low. The marshal there, Henry Collins, was a good man. His wife, Sarah, was beautiful, kind. Everyone loved her. Wade's jaw tightened. Including me, though I never acted on it, never would have. Margaret's hand came to rest lightly on his arm, encouraging him to continue. A gang came through town. The leader, man named Reeves, took a fancy to Sarah. When the marshal tried to intervene, they shot him down in the street. Wade's eyes closed briefly against the memory. I wasn't there. I was out on patrol. By the time I got back, they'd taken Sarah and left the marshal for dead. Oh, Wade, Margaret whispered. I tracked them for 3 days, Wade continued, the words coming easier now that he'd started. Found them in an abandoned mining camp, 6 of them, all armed. I waited until nightfall, then went in. His voice hardened. I killed them all, every last one. But not before Reeves had, he broke off, unable to say the words. Sarah? Margaret asked gently. She was alive, but broken in ways that couldn't be mended. She took her own life 2 weeks later. Wade finally turned to look at Margaret, expecting to see disgust or fear in her eyes. Instead, he found only compassion. The territorial marshal ruled it justified, but the town, they looked at me differently after that, like I was something dangerous, so I left. Margaret's hand moved from his arm to take his hand, her fingers twining with his. You did what anyone with honor would have done, Wade. I've killed men, Margaret, he said bluntly. More than I can justify, even to myself. That's not something an honorable man carries. My father once told me that there are 2 kinds of violence in this world, Margaret said, her voice steady. The kind that comes from hatred and greed, and the kind that comes from the need to protect those who cannot protect themselves. One corrupts the soul. The other, painful as it may be, comes from love. She squeezed his hand gently. I know which kind lives in you, Wade Harrington. Her words washed over him like a benediction, offering a forgiveness he hadn't known he was seeking. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to stay in Red Bluff, to build a life here with her. But Blackwell's knowledge of his past had changed the equation. If the man was willing to dig up that buried history, what else might he uncover? What other threats might follow Wade to Margaret's door? We should consider his offer, Wade said reluctantly. If Blackwell is willing to pay a fair price for your land, no. Margaret's refusal was immediate and firm. This isn't just about the land anymore, Wade. It's about justice. If Blackwell can force me out with threats, who will be next? Widow Reynolds, the Millers? Someone has to stand against him. It's dangerous, Margaret, Wade warned. These aren't men who fight fair. Neither are we, she countered with unexpected steel in her voice. We have the truth on our side, and soon the law as well. I won't run, Wade. Not from Blackwell, not from this fight. Looking into her determined face, illuminated by the last glow of twilight, Wade felt something shift inside him. This brave, principled woman was willing to risk everything for what she believed was right. Could he do any less? Then we face him together, Wade decided. But not at the Paradise Saloon, that's his territory. If Blackwell wants to talk, he can come here in daylight, unarmed. Margaret nodded, a smile breaking across her face. Together, then. As darkness settled fully over Red Bluff, Wade found himself lingering on the porch with Margaret longer than was strictly necessary, their hands still joined, their conversation turning from danger to more personal matters. She told him about growing up back east, about her mother's death when she was 12, about her dreams of someday starting a proper school of her own. In turn, he shared stories of his travels, the beauty he'd witnessed in the untamed landscapes of the West, the good people he'd met along his journey. For the first time in years, Wade found himself speaking of the future as something to look forward to, rather than simply endure. When they finally said goodnight, Wade remained on the porch after Margaret went inside, keeping watch and pondering the unexpected turn his life had taken. He'd come to Red Bluff to fulfill a promise to an old friend, but found himself bound by new promises, new possibilities that both exhilarated and terrified him. Dawn broke over Red Bluff with the promise of another scorching day. Wade had dozed in the rocking chair on the porch for a few hours, his rifle across his lap, waking at every sound. Now, as the eastern sky blushed pink and gold, he rose stiffly and stretched his sore muscles. The door opened behind him and Margaret emerged, already dressed, her hair neatly arranged. She carried 2 steaming cups of coffee. "You should have come inside," she scolded gently, handing him one of the cups. Wade accepted it gratefully. "Easier to keep watch out here." They stood side by side, watching the sun creep above the horizon, neither mentioning the message they'd sent to Blackwell late the previous night, delivered by one of Margaret's former students. If Blackwell wanted to negotiate, he would come to the Kendrick property at 10 that morning. Alone and unarmed. "Do you think he'll come?" Margaret asked finally, voicing the question that had been on both their minds. "Yes," Wade replied after a moment's consideration. "His pride won't let him refuse, but he won't come alone and he certainly won't come unarmed." Margaret nodded, her expression grave but determined. "Then we should be prepared." By 9:30, they had made their preparations. Widow Reynolds and 2 other women from town had arrived, ostensibly for a social call, but each carried a shotgun concealed beneath a shawl. 4 of Margaret's former students, now young men of 17 and 18, positioned themselves casually around the property, their presence providing additional witnesses and deterrence. At precisely 10 o'clock, a cloud of dust on the road announced the approach of riders. Blackwell came into view first, riding a magnificent black stallion, dressed as if for a business meeting in town rather than a confrontation at a remote farmhouse. Behind him rode 6 men, including the scarred gunman from the previous day. Wade stepped off the porch as they approached, his stance casual but his hand never far from his holster. Margaret stood slightly behind him, flanked by the widow and her friends. Blackwell reined in his horse at the gate, his eyes narrowing as he took in the assembled group. "I thought we agreed to a private discussion, Harrington. You brought friends," Wade pointed out mildly, nodding toward the men behind Blackwell. "Miss Kendrick brought friends too, seems fair." Blackwell's jaw tightened, but he dismounted and approached the gate alone. "May I enter to speak with Miss Kendrick?" "You may speak from there," Margaret called, her voice steady despite the tension evident in her posture. Blackwell's thin smile didn't reach his eyes. "Very well. Miss Kendrick, I've come to make you a final offer for your property. $5,000, a generous sum for a piece of land this size, even with the spring." Murmurs ran through the assembled witnesses. It was indeed a substantial amount, more than most of them would see in years of labor. "The land isn't for sale, Mr. Blackwell," Margaret replied firmly. "Be reasonable," Blackwell urged, his affable tone at odds with the cold calculation in his eyes. "You're a young woman alone. This is no place for you. Take the money, move back east where you belong." "I'm exactly where I belong," Margaret countered. "This land was my father's legacy to me, and I intend to honor that legacy by staying." Blackwell's pleasant facade slipped slightly. "Your father was a stubborn fool who didn't understand progress. Don't make his mistake." Wade took a step forward, his hand dropping to rest on his holster. You do well to speak respectfully of Thomas Kendrick on his daughter's property, Blackwell. The businessman's eyes flicked to Wade, cold with barely contained fury. Still hiding behind Harrington, I see. Did he tell you what kind of man he really is, Miss Kendrick? The blood on his hands. I know exactly what kind of man Wade Harrington is, Margaret replied, moving forward to stand beside Wade. A better man than you could ever hope to be. Blackwell's face flushed with anger. This is your final chance. Take my offer or face the consequences. The only consequences that need concern you are legal ones, Margaret said calmly. The territorial court hearing is in 11 days. I suggest you prepare your defense, Mr. Blackwell. You won't live to see that hearing, Blackwell snarled, his composure finally cracking. Neither of you will. Wade's gun cleared its holster with lightning speed, aimed squarely at Blackwell's chest. That sounded remarkably like a threat against Miss Kendrick's life, made in front of multiple witnesses. That's a hanging offense in this territory. Blackwell paled slightly, suddenly aware of the many eyes watching the exchange. His men had tensed, hands hovering near weapons, but they made no move, recognizing the precarious position of their employer. You misunderstood me, Blackwell backtracked hastily. I merely meant that legal proceedings can be unpredictable. I understood you perfectly, Wade replied, his voice dangerously soft. Now, I suggest you get back on that fine horse of yours and ride away. And if any harm comes to Miss Kendrick or her property before the hearing, I will hold you personally responsible. Do we understand each other? The two men locked eyes in a silent battle of wills. Finally, Blackwell nodded curtly. Perfectly. He turned to go, then paused. This isn't over, Harrington. No, Wade agreed, holstering his weapon with deliberate slowness. But it will be soon. After Blackwell and his men had ridden away, leaving only a cloud of dust in their wake, the tension around the farmhouse gradually eased. The young men departed for their own homes, promising to keep watch from a distance, while Widow Reynolds and her friends insisted on staying to prepare a midday meal. That man's dangerous as a rattlesnake, the widow declared as she busied herself in Margaret's kitchen. But he's also a coward at heart. Standing up to him was the right thing to do. Margaret helped set the table, her movements brisk but her eyes troubled. He'll try something before the hearing. He's too desperate now. Wade, leaning against the doorframe, nodded in agreement. We'll need to be vigilant. I don't think he'll risk another direct confrontation, not with so many witnesses today, but he has other options. What do you suggest? Margaret asked, looking to him for guidance. I'll ride to Prescott tomorrow, Wade decided. Speak with the territorial marshal, request protection until the hearing. It's only a 2-day ride each way. Margaret's face paled. You're leaving? Just for a few days, he assured her. You'll be safe with the neighbors keeping watch. Blackwell won't try anything major while I'm gone. He knows I'd come back. Though she nodded in agreement, Wade could see Margaret was troubled by the plan. After their meal, when the widow and her friends had departed with promises to return that evening, Margaret finally voiced her concerns. What if he follows you? She asked as they stood on the porch, watching the sun begin its westward descent. What if this is exactly what he wants to separate us? Wade had considered this possibility. That's a risk we have to take. Without the marshal's support, we're vulnerable. With it, Blackwell's finished. Margaret turned to face him directly, her expression earnest. Promise me you'll be careful. Blackwell knows about your past. He might use that against you. I promise, Wade said solemnly. And you promise me you'll stay on guard while I'm gone. Don't go anywhere alone. Keep your pistol with you at all times. I promise, she echoed, a small smile touching her lips despite the seriousness of their situation. Something in her smile, in the trust shining from her eyes, caused a sudden tightness in Wade's chest. Without conscious thought, he reached out to brush a stray lock of hair from her cheek, his fingers lingering against her skin. Margaret, he began, his voice rougher than he intended. She leaned slightly into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. Yes. The setting sun cast a golden glow over her face, highlighting the delicate curve of her cheekbone, the warmth in her hazel eyes, the softness of her lips that were now slightly parted in anticipation. Wade found himself leaning closer, drawn by a force he could no longer resist. Their first kiss was gentle, hesitant a question rather than a demand. When Margaret responded, her hand coming up to rest against his chest, the kiss deepened, becoming something neither had expected but both had longed for. When they finally parted, Wade rested his forehead against hers, his heart racing. "I've been wanting to do that for days," he confessed. Margaret's soft laugh warmed the small space between them. "I've been hoping you would." The simple admission filled Wade with a joy he'd almost forgotten could exist. For a moment, the threats surrounding them receded, leaving only this perfect connection between two people who had found each other against all odds. "When this is over," Wade said, his voice low and earnest, "when Blackwell is gone and you're safe, I'd like to stay in Red Bluff, if you'll have me." Margaret's smile was answer enough, but she said the words anyway, sealing them with another kiss. "Nothing would make me happier." The following morning dawned clear and bright, the promise of the previous day's kisses tempered by the reality of Wade's impending departure. He saddled his horse before sunrise, wanting to cover as much ground as possible before the day's heat became unbearable. Margaret stood at the gate, a cloth-wrapped package of food in her hands. "Enough for 2 days," she explained as she handed it to him. "Don't try to make the journey in one stretch. Even you need rest, Wade Harrington." He tucked the package into his saddlebag, touched by her concern. "Yes, madam," he replied with a mock salute that brought a smile to her face. The smile faded as she reached up to straighten his bandana, her fingers lingering at his collar. 8 days until the hearing. You'll be back in time." "I'll be back in 4, he promised. 5 at the most." Widow Reynolds and her nephew arrived as they spoke, having agreed to stay with Margaret during Wade's absence. Their presence was both reassuring and an intrusion on what both Wade and Margaret wished could be a more private farewell. "Safe travels, Mr. Harrington," the widow called as she bustled toward the house. "We'll look after Miss Kendrick as if she were our own." Wade tipped his hat in acknowledgement before turning his attention back to Margaret. "Remember your promise," he said quietly. "Stay vigilant." "And you remember yours," she replied. "Come back to me safely." He leaned down from the saddle to kiss her once more, not caring who might see or what they might think. "Nothing could stop me," he vowed. As he rode away, Wade glanced back several times to see Margaret still standing at the gate, her hand raised in farewell. The sight both strengthened his resolve and caused an ache in his chest. For the first time in years, he had someone to come back to, and the knowledge was both terrifying and exhilarating. The journey to Prescott was uneventful but grueling. Summer had settled over the territory with relentless heat, forcing Wade to travel in the cooler hours of early morning and evening, resting during the scorching midday. He pushed himself and his horse hard, covering ground that would normally take 3 days in just over 2. Prescott, the territorial capital, was a bustling town compared to Red Bluff, with its broad streets and substantial government buildings. Wade made his way directly to the marshal's office, dust-covered and weary from the trail. Marshal Robert Jenkins was a burly man with graying whiskers and shrewd eyes that had seen their share of deception. He listened carefully as Wade explained the situation in Red Bluff, his expression growing increasingly grave. "James Blackwell," the marshal repeated when Wade finished. "That name's been crossing my desk with troubling frequency lately. Land disputes, water rights, allegations of intimidation, all dismissed by local authorities. He has Red Bluff's sheriff and judge in his pocket," Wade explained. Jenkins nodded grimly. "Not uncommon in these small towns, unfortunately, but threatening a woman, staging a fraudulent auction that crosses the line into territorial jurisdiction. Will you help us?" Wade asked directly. The marshal studied him for a long moment. "I know your reputation, Harrington. Good with a gun, stand by your word, but also that business in Dodge City. That was 3 years ago, Wade said tightly. Judge ruled it justified. So he did, Jenkins agreed. And from what I heard, those men deserved what they got. He leaned back in his chair, considering. The hearing is in a week, you say? 6 days now, Wade confirmed. Jenkins nodded decisively. I'll ride back with you, bring 2 deputies. We'll ensure Miss Kendrick reaches the hearing safely. He fixed Wade with a penetrating look. But I need to know, is there anything personal between you and Blackwell? Anything beyond protecting Thomas Kendrick's daughter? Wade met his gaze steadily. Nothing beyond wanting to see justice done. And he hesitated before admitting the truth, keeping Margaret safe. A knowing smile touched the marshal's weathered face. I see. Well, that's as good a reason as any. We'll leave at first light tomorrow. My men and I need to gather supplies and make arrangements. Wade wanted to protest the delay, but he recognized the practicality of the marshal's decision. One more day wouldn't make a difference, and arriving in Red Bluff with the territorial marshal and 2 deputies would send a powerful message to Blackwell. Thank you, Marshal, Wade said, extending his hand. Jenkins shook it firmly. Don't thank me yet. Blackwell's type doesn't surrender easily. There may be blood before this is over. Wade's expression hardened. If there is, it won't be Margaret's. The following morning, Wade met the marshal and his deputies at the edge of town just as the sun was breaking over the eastern mountains. The lawmen were well equipped, each leading a pack horse loaded with supplies in addition to their own mounts. Ready to ride, Harrington? Jenkins called as Wade approached. The return journey seemed both faster and more tense than the ride to Prescott. Though they encountered no trouble on the trail, Wade couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping away too quickly. By the end of the 3rd day, his anxiety had grown to the point that Marshal Jenkins noticed. We're making good time, the marshal assured him as they made camp that evening. We'll reach Red Bluff by midday tomorrow, Wade nodded, adding another stick to their small fire. Just a feeling I can't shake, Marshal, like something's wrong. Jenkins studied him thoughtfully. I've learned to trust those feelings. They've kept me alive more than once. One of the deputies, a young man named Carter, looked up from tending the horses. Maybe we should push on through the night, the marshal considered the suggestion. Risky in this terrain after dark, but we could start before dawn, be in Red Bluff by mid-morning. The decision made, they turned in early, agreeing to set out while the stars were still bright in the sky. Wade lay awake long after the others were asleep, staring at the vast expanse above, his thoughts on Margaret. He'd left her well protected, surrounded by people who cared for her. She would be fine, he told himself repeatedly. The uneasiness was just his own fear of losing the unexpected happiness he'd found. Yet, when he finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, his dreams were filled with flames and Margaret's desperate cries. They broke camp before the first hint of dawn, riding hard through the lightening landscape. As they crested the final ridge overlooking Red Bluff, Wade's heart stopped in his chest. A plume of black smoke rose from the direction of Margaret's farm. Without a word to the others, Wade dug his heels into his horse's sides, urging the animal to a full gallop down the slope. He heard the marshal's shout behind him but didn't slow. As he approached the Kendrick property, the scene that greeted him confirmed his worst fears. The small farmhouse was engulfed in flames, the heat so intense that he could feel it from the road. Several neighbors were frantically passing buckets of water in a futile attempt to control the blaze. Wade leapt from his horse before it had fully stopped, running toward the nearest figure, Widow Reynolds's nephew, his face blackened with soot. "Margaret?" Wade demanded, gripping the young man's shoulders. "Where is she?" The young man's expression crumpled. "They took her, Mr. Harrington." Blackwell's men, they came before dawn, set fire to the barn first. When we ran out to help, they grabbed Miss Kendrick. "How long ago?" Wade's voice was barely recognizable even to his own ears. 2 hours, maybe 3. We tried to follow, but they had too many men. Marshal Jenkins and his deputies arrived as Wade was questioning the young man, quickly taking in the situation. "Blackwell," the marshal asked grimly. Wade nodded, his face a mask of controlled fury. Took her to, maybe 3 hours ago. Jenkins turned to his deputies. Carter, help these folks with the fire. Morris, start questioning witnesses. I want to know exactly what happened and which way they went. To Wade, he added in a lower voice, we'll find her, Harrington. Blackwell's desperate, but he's not stupid. He won't hurt her before the hearing. You don't know that, Wade replied, his hand clenching and unclenching at his side. He's cornered now. Cornered men do terrible things. Then we need to move fast, Jenkins agreed, but not blindly. Give me 10 minutes to gather information, then we ride. Those 10 minutes were among the longest of Wade's life. He paced the yard, unable to look at the burning remains of the house where he and Margaret had shared their first kiss less than a week ago. The home her father had built, now reduced to ash and charred timber. When Jenkins returned, his expression was grave but determined. They headed west toward Blackwell's ranch, 6 men, Margaret bound but conscious. According to the widow, she fought like a wildcat. A flicker of pride cut through Wade's fear. Of course she had fought. Margaret Kendrick wasn't one to surrender easily, no matter the odds. The ranch is about an hour's ride from here, Wade said, already moving toward his horse. Fortified main house, several outbuildings. Blackwell keeps at least a dozen men there at all times. Jenkins frowned. Not good odds, even with my deputies. I'm not waiting for better odds, Wade stated flatly, checking his pistol and rifle. Every minute she's in Blackwell's hands is a minute too long. The marshal studied him for a moment before nodding. Agreed, but we do this smart, not reckless. I need your word on that, Harrington. Wade met his gaze steadily. You have it, but we're bringing her out today one way or another. As they rode toward Blackwell's ranch, Wade's mind raced through every possible scenario, every potential approach. By the time the sprawling property came into view, he had a plan risky, but with a chance of success if luck was on their side. Direct assault would be suicide, he told Jenkins as they observed the ranch from a concealed position on a nearby hill. But there's a back entrance to the main house through the kitchen. Servants use it, less guarded. How do you know that? Jenkins asked, eyebrows raised. Thomas mentioned it once, Wade explained. He delivered firewood to Blackwell when he first arrived in town before they became enemies. Jenkins nodded slowly. So we need a diversion at the front while someone slips in the back. Exactly, Wade confirmed. Your deputies can create the diversion, make it look like a larger force than it is. Meanwhile, you and I go in the back, find Margaret. The marshal considered the plan. Risky if Blackwell's men realize it's just a diversion. We don't have time for anything more elaborate, Wade pointed out. Every minute we wait, I know, Jenkins interrupted. I don't like it, but I don't see a better option. Let's move. The plan was set in motion as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Deputies Carter and Morris approached the ranch from the east, firing shots into the air and creating the impression of a larger force attacking. As Blackwell's men rushed to defend the front of the property, Wade and the marshal circled around to the rear. The kitchen entrance was guarded by a single man, easily subdued by Jenkins with the butt of his pistol. Inside, they found a terrified cook and a young servant girl, both of whom immediately pointed upstairs when asked about Margaret. Blackwell's office, the cook whispered. Second floor, end of the hall. Wade took the stairs 2 at a time, Jenkins close behind. The upstairs hallway was empty, most of the ranch's defenders drawn outside by the diversion. At the end of the corridor, a heavy oak door stood closed but not locked. Wade paused, listening. He could hear voices inside, Blackwell's cultured tones and another man's rougher speech, but no Margaret. His heart pounded in his chest. Had they moved her? Was she even still alive? Jenkins nodded once, signaling his readiness. Wade took a deep breath, then threw open the door, his gun leveled at the room's occupants. Blackwell sat behind a massive desk, appearing unsurprised by the intrusion. Beside him stood the scarred gunman who had delivered his message days earlier. And there, bound to a chair in the corner, was Margaret. Her face was bruised, a cut on her lip crusted with dried blood, but her eyes were alert and filled with relief at the sight of Wade. "Harrington," Blackwell greeted him calmly. "Right on time." The casual statement sent a chill down Wade's spine. This had been a trap, the diversion outside now serving Blackwell's purposes rather than their own. "Let her go," Wade demanded, his gun trained on Blackwell's chest. "It's over." Blackwell smiled thinly. "I think not. You see, we have a bit of a standoff here. Your deputies outside are now surrounded by my men, and while you could certainly shoot me where I sit, my friend here would kill Miss Kendrick before I hit the floor." He gestured to the scarred man, who now held a pistol pointed at Margaret's head. "Don't listen to him, Wade," Margaret called, her voice hoarse but strong. "He's going to kill us anyway." The scarred man pressed his gun harder against her temple, silencing her. "That depends entirely on Mr. Harrington," Blackwell replied smoothly. "I'm prepared to be reasonable." "What do you want?" Wade asked, though he already knew the answer. "Your departure from the territory," Blackwell stated, "permanently. And Miss Kendrick's signature on a deed transferring her property to me. In exchange, you both live." Jenkins, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. "You're forgetting something, Blackwell. I'm the territorial marshal. Even if Harrington and Miss Kendrick agree to your terms, you're facing charges for kidnapping, arson, and attempted murder. That's a hanging offense." Blackwell's smile didn't waver. "An unfortunate misunderstanding, Marshal. Miss Kendrick is here of her own free will, as she'll testify. As for the fire, tragic accident. Lamps can be so dangerous when knocked over." "No one will believe that," Jenkins scoffed. "They will when the alternative is Miss Kendrick's untimely death," Blackwell countered. "Now, shall we discuss terms like civilized people? Put down your weapons, gentlemen." Wade's mind raced, assessing options, calculating risks. The scarred gunman was too far from Margaret for Wade to reach him before he could pull the trigger. If he shot Blackwell first, Margaret would die. If he aimed for the gunman, Blackwell would draw his own weapon. "Wade," Margaret said softly, drawing his gaze. Something in her expression gave him pause. She held his eyes for a long moment, then glanced deliberately downward. Wade followed her gaze and noticed for the first time that her hands, though bound to the chair arms, had worked partially free of their ropes. Margaret gave the slightest nod, and Wade understood. She was ready to move when he was. "All right, Blackwell," Wade said slowly, lowering his gun slightly as if in surrender. "You win, just don't hurt her." Blackwell's triumphant smile never reached his eyes. "Wise decision. Now place your weapons on the floor." Wade began to bend as if complying, then suddenly dived to the right, firing as he moved. His bullet caught the scarred gunman in the shoulder, spinning him away from Margaret. In the same instant, Margaret lunged forward, freeing her hands completely and throwing herself to the floor. Blackwell reached for a drawer in his desk, but Jenkins was faster, his shot striking Blackwell in the chest. The businessman collapsed backward in his chair, eyes wide with shock. The scarred gunman recovered quickly despite his wound, raising his pistol toward Margaret's prone form. Wade's second shot struck true, catching him between the eyes. In the sudden silence that followed, Wade rushed to Margaret's side, helping her to her feet and checking her for serious injuries. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, gently touching the bruise on her cheek. "Nothing that won't heal," she assured him, her arms going around his neck as she leaned into his embrace. "I knew you'd come." Wade held her tightly, his heart still racing with the nearness of their escape. "I'm sorry I left. I should have been there when they came." "Don't," Margaret said firmly, drawing back to look into his face. "You came back for me, that's what matters." A groan from Blackwell drew their attention. The businessman was still alive, blood spreading across his expensive shirt. Marshal Jenkins stood over him, his expression grim. "It's over, Blackwell," the marshal stated. "You've lost." Blackwell's eyes fixed on Wade and Margaret with undisguised hatred. "This changes nothing," he gasped. "Men like me, we always win in the end, others will come, take what I couldn't." Wade stepped forward, his arm still protectively around Margaret's shoulders. "Not in Red Bluff, they won't. Not anymore." Blackwell's reply was cut short by a final, rattling breath. His eyes stared sightlessly at the ceiling, his grand ambitions ended by a single bullet. Jenkins holstered his weapon. "We need to check on my deputies. Blackwell's men might surrender when they learn he's dead, but I wouldn't count on it." As they made their way downstairs, shots still occasionally rang out from the front of the property. Jenkins went ahead to negotiate, while Wade and Margaret waited in the relative safety of the kitchen. "What happened after I left?" Wade asked softly, examining the cut on Margaret's lip with gentle fingers. "2 days after you rode out, Blackwell's men started watching the house more openly," Margaret explained. "Widow Reynolds insisted on staying with me night and day. This morning, just before dawn, they attacked, set fire to the barn to draw us out, then grabbed me." Her voice faltered slightly. "They burned the house, Wade, everything my father built." Wade pulled her close again, his chin resting on the top of her head. "Houses can be rebuilt, you're what matters." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You said that before, at the auction, I pay what matters." "And I meant it," Wade said softly. "You matter, Margaret, more than anything." The gunfire outside had ceased, replaced by the authoritative voice of Marshal Jenkins. A few minutes later, the marshal returned, looking weary but satisfied. "Blackwell's men have surrendered," he reported. "My deputies are securing them now. We'll take them back to Prescott for trial." "And Blackwell?" Margaret asked. "Dead men face a higher judgment than ours," Jenkins replied simply. "But his reign of terror over Red Bluff is finished." The ride back to town was somber. News of Blackwell's death and the destruction of the Kendrick farm spread quickly, drawing a crowd to the main street as they arrived. Many faces showed shame or regret townspeople who had stood by while injustice flourished in their midst. Sheriff Holden was conspicuously absent, having fled town at the first word of the territorial marshal's arrival. The town judge, however, was taken into custody by Jenkins's deputies to face charges of corruption and abuse of power. Widow Reynolds insisted that Margaret stay with her until other arrangements could be made. "My house isn't grand," she said firmly, "but there's plenty of room and you're welcome for as long as you need." Margaret thanked her with a weary smile, but her eyes sought Wade's. "Will you stay too?" She asked quietly as they stood on the widow's porch that evening, in Red Bluff, Wade clarified, his heart quickening at the question. "With me," Margaret said simply. Wade took her hands in his thumbs tracing gentle circles on her skin. "There's nothing I want more," he admitted. "But are you sure? My past is past," she interrupted. "I know who you are, Wade Harrington. I know the man who rode for days to find help for me, who faced down Blackwell and his men without hesitation, who treats me not as something fragile to be protected, but as someone strong enough to stand beside him." Her eyes held his, unwavering. "That's the man I've fallen in love with." The words hung in the air between them, a declaration that changed everything. Wade felt a lifetime of restlessness, of running, of solitude dissolve in the warmth of her gaze. "I love you too," he said, the words coming easier than he'd expected. "I think I have since that first day on the auction platform when you stood there defiant despite everything." Margaret smiled, wincing slightly as the expression pulled at her cut lip. "Then stay, help me rebuild. Not just the house, but everything the school I wanted to start, a community where people look out for each other instead of looking away." Wade drew her closer, mindful of her injuries. "I can think of no better future," he murmured before kissing her gently. In the weeks that followed, Red Bluff began to transform. With Blackwell gone and his corrupt allies removed from power, the town elected new leadership, including a young, honest sheriff recommended by Marshal Jenkins. The farmers and ranchers who had lived under Blackwell's shadow for so long found their voices again, joining together to help rebuild Margaret's home. Wade threw himself into the construction, working from dawn until dusk alongside the townspeople. The new house took shape quickly, larger and sturdier than the original, with a special addition at the back, a schoolroom where Margaret could teach without having to walk into town. "It's perfect," she declared when the room was finished, running her hands along the smooth wooden desks Wade had crafted himself. "Better than I ever imagined." Wade watched her from the doorway, still sometimes unable to believe his good fortune. "Just like everything else about you," he replied, coming to stand beside her. Margaret turned to face him, her bruises now faded to faint shadows, her smile unrestricted by pain. "Have you thought about my proposal?" she asked, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "Every minute of every day," Wade admitted. 3 nights earlier, as they'd sat on the porch of her newly completed home, Margaret had asked Wade to marry her, pointing out that life was too short and precious to waste on convention. "And?" she prompted, her expression suddenly vulnerable beneath the playfulness. Wade reached into his pocket and produced a small silver ring, simple but beautifully crafted, set with a single turquoise stone that matched the color of the Arizona sky. "I was waiting until the house was finished," he explained, suddenly nervous. "I wanted to do this properly." Margaret's eyes widened as he dropped to one knee before her. "Margaret Kendrick," he began, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart, "you asked me to stay, to help you rebuild, to be part of your future. I want all of that and more. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep next to you every night. I want to build a life with you that neither of us could have imagined before we found each other." He held up the ring. "Will you marry me?" Tears spilled from Margaret's eyes as she nodded, too overcome for words at first. "Yes," she finally managed, extending her trembling hand. "Yes, Wade Harrington, I will marry you." The ring slid perfectly onto her finger, as if it had been made for her alone. Wade stood and gathered her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. The wedding took place 2 months later, on a perfect autumn day when the distant mountains were painted in shades of gold and crimson. The entire town turned out for the celebration, held on the grounds of the new Kendrick Harrington home. Widow Reynolds wept openly during the ceremony, later declaring it the finest wedding Red Bluff had ever seen. Marshal Jenkins made the journey from Prescott to attend, bringing news that all of Blackwell's former associates had been convicted and sentenced. "Red Bluff is free and clear," he told Wade at the reception. "You've helped build something good here, Harrington." "We're just getting started," Wade replied, his eyes finding Margaret across the gathering, radiant in her wedding dress as she laughed with a group of children. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land that had once been a battleground and was now a home, Wade found a moment alone with his new wife. They stood on the porch of their house, looking out at the future they would build together. "Happy?" he asked, his arm around her waist. Margaret leaned her head against his shoulder. "More than I ever thought possible," she admitted. "When they dragged me onto that auction platform, I thought my life was over. I never imagined it was just beginning." Wade pressed a kiss to her temple. "I pay what matters," he repeated softly. "And you, Margaret Harrington, matter more than anything in this world." 5 years later, on another perfect autumn day, Wade sat on that same porch, watching as Margaret moved through the garden with their 3-year-old son, Thomas, toddling at her side. Her other hand rested on the gentle swell of her belly, where their second child grew. Red Bluff had prospered in the years since Blackwell's death. The school Margaret had started in their home had grown into a proper building in town, with 3 teachers and nearly 50 students. Wade had served as sheriff for 2 years before being elected mayor, a position he approached with the same integrity and determination he brought to everything. The spring on their property, once coveted by Blackwell for its value in controlling the surrounding ranches, now provided water for a community irrigation system that benefited everyone. The Harrington home had become a gathering place for town meetings, celebrations, and the quiet formation of friendships that strengthened the community. As Wade watched his wife and son, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From a restless drifter with blood on his hands to a husband, father, and community leader. From a man who never stayed in one place to a man who had found his home. Margaret looked up and caught his eye, smiling the smile that still made his heart skip a beat. She whispered something to Thomas, who immediately broke into a run toward the porch, his chubby legs pumping with determination. "Papa," the boy cried as Wade scooped him up. "Mama says time for supper." "Is that so?" Wade asked, tickling his son until the boy squealed with laughter. Margaret joined them on the porch, her face glowing with contentment. "And she says she loves you," she added, her voice soft with emotion even after years of marriage. Wade stood, balancing Thomas on one arm while his other hand reached for his wife. "I love you too," he replied, the words as true now as the first time he'd spoken them. "Both of you." His hand gently touched her growing belly. "All of you." As the sun set over Red Bluff, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, the Harringtons went inside to their evening meal, secure in the knowledge that what truly mattered, love, family, community, could never be auctioned away or stolen by force. It could only be freely given, as Margaret and Wade had given their hearts to each other, creating a legacy far more valuable than land or gold. A legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone. In that moment, as in countless moments before and countless yet to come, Wade knew with absolute certainty that some debts could never be fully repaid, like the debt he owed to Thomas Kendrick for leading him to Margaret, or the debt he owed to Margaret herself for showing him the way home. But in loving her, in building this life together, he paid what mattered most. And that, in the end, was everything.